As we talk about Iran, what President Trump did, what he didn't do, I'd like to reassert what I've always asserted. It doesn't matter who the president is, what changes he promises, because we are an imperial power, and whoever is elected to the highest office is perforce an imperialist. And the imposition of imperialism necessitates violence and the exploitation of the opportunities that spring from a regional and global destabilization. Here's Hillary Clinton from 2015.
To know that if I'm the president, we will attack Iran. Whatever stage of development they might be in their nuclear weapons program in the next 10 years, during which they might foolishly consider launching an attack on Israel, we would be able to totally obliterate them. That's a terrible thing to say, but those people who run Iran need to understand that, because that perhaps will deter them from doing something that would be reckless,
foolish, and tragic. And of course, I'd like to remind everyone that while, the United States has waged imperial war and regime change across the globe for decades, predating World War II, people forget about our occupation of the Philippines. But yeah, Iran has done none of that. And I just thought I'd like to bring up, Hillary Clinton quote, great, because she is basically advancing women's equality by proving that, they can be just as evil as men. So anyways, y'all, hello and welcome to State of Play on Mint Press News, where tonight we'll be discussing Iran with returning political analysts and contributors Batool Subeiti and Elina Xenophontos. Their profiles are linked in the description. Thanks so much for coming on. It's been very last minute. This weekend's been insane. Cheers, y'all.
I'm happy to be on. It's going to be an interesting conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us, Greg.
All right. And before we get into that, we do live in a certain economic system. So we are on Patreon because Mint Press News is demonetized on all platforms. We're a small independent newsroom that has no corporate sponsors. If you're picking up what we're putting down, consider checking us out and supporting us on Patreon. If not, because you're getting nickeled and dimed by late stage capitalism, we get it. We're just glad you're here. You can like, share, and subscribe. And now my least favorite part of the show notes is over with. So after Israel's surprise attack on Iran on Friday, there have been days of escalating strikes between the two long-standing enemies. Israel's surprise attack on targets across Iran on Friday has been followed by 3 days of escalations as both sides threatened more devastation in the biggest ever confrontation between them. So here's kind of like a roundup. So Israel hit more than 100 major targets in Iran on Friday, including nuclear facilities and missile sites, but also, and this is something that's not really being reported by the media, senior military commanders and scientists who were targeted just like Hezbollah targets or Syria targets or people in Gaza at home. I believe they killed a professor at home, his wife, his kid, because they're dropping apartment buildings and residential neighborhoods in Tehran. So, among them killed were senior military figures, including Major General Mohammad Bagheri and commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, General Hussein Salami, as well as at least six Iranian nuclear scientists. So, basically, generally targets that they've hit before. And of course, these strikes continued over the weekend. And Israel's military said it hit more than 80 targets in Tehran since Saturday, including the defense headquarters. And of course, Iran has accused Israel of hitting civilian areas, with the health ministry reporting that Israeli strikes had killed 224 people since Friday. And since then, Iran has launched several waves of missiles at Israel since then, with Israeli authorities saying at least 14 people had been killed since Friday and 390 injured. So basically, rescuers and medics said a strike late on Saturday destroyed a 3-story building in the town of Tamra, killing 4 women, 6 people were killed, and at least 180 injured at the site of a missile strike in Bat Yam near Tel Aviv. Those numbers were set to rise on Monday after Iranian missiles struck Tel Aviv and Haifa, with fires seen burning at a power plant in the northern city. So the situation is changing rapidly. Before we get into the bulk of the episode, I was wondering if you, Batool, had any initial thoughts, seeing that we recorded an episode on this specifically 2 weeks ago in London.
Yes, absolutely. I think I'll start off with why America greenlit the attack on Iran. ultimately it's because America wants to measure the response of Iran. And I remember I gave you actually a similar response when we were having the conversation, is that America wants to gauge the power balance on the ground. And accordingly, it will decide the shape of the future regional confrontations and the policies that it wants to build for the region respectively. So if Iran's reaction proves decisive in this confrontation, then obviously that hit will severely weaken the Israeli occupation entity and could change the political regional landscape. In that scenario, I believe American support for Israel will shrink to match Israel's true size. But if Iran's response proves to be weak, or within the line that, for example, we saw with Operation True Promise 1 and 2, where they were kind of like short and kind of like decisive responses that were not kind of elongated or prolonged, then that would give an indication to America that the whole resistance axis is weak if the Iranian response is weak. And in that scenario, of course, Israel would emerge much stronger. So America in this situation really wants to see the credibility of Iran and how it would respond. So it's basically testing the waters out. And here it's important to note that Israel is bearing the brunt of all of this. Israel is almost like the collateral for America right now, unless, of course, America decided that it wanted to directly get involved in the war, which I still, until today, believe that that's very unlikely, because we're not talking about American politics now, but we're talking about Trump's America, someone who's leading a big change within America itself, and how its conduct with the world should be. As a MAGA man, someone who is a proponent of removing bases, reducing them, cutting losses, economic hegemony and sanctions, he tries to deal with entities in the world on a transactional basis. And he supports military bases where he feels American strength. So in places like Canada, Greenland, we hear them say stuff like that. But military intervention in areas like West Asia, if he sees that it will cost America more than it will benefit America, he's not likely to get involved in the direct sense. He may support Israel in terms of defense, but in terms of striking, if he expects that the American military bases in the region will be obliterated, it's not expected that Trump would directly get involved unless he guarantees that that intervention will not lead to negative consequences in terms of America's regional presence. But in my opinion, after testing the waters in Yemen and now seeing Iran's strength in its precision and its ability to cause this level of destruction within the Israeli occupation entity, I don't believe that he will get involved directly per se.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, guys. I have this like new kitten behind me, and it's activated a ball. I know we're recording live, but just if you see weird noises, we apologize. Okay, so anyways, moving on. Like, Elina, yeah, you kind of thought that this would happen. Any initial thoughts? Like, I thought it was going to happen. It would be like after the next round of talks, but I guess sabotaging any chance of negotiations, either by directly killing people like proponents of like ceasefire and negotiations like Ismail Haniyeh. Yeah, this is kind of like their modus operandi.
Yeah, so what I had argued in the podcast that we had done on Colonial Outcast was that I thought that this would happen over the course of the weekend. I was off by maybe a day. I was thinking it was going to happen on Saturday or Sunday, and it happened by, I think it was a Friday. So this is the thing. So what the United States and Israel, because again, like I've said before, they are working, this is a joint operation between the two, no matter how much Trump is trying to allude to the fact that, we're not directly involved, but then at the same time, he's got on his true social medias and essentially kind of alluded to the fact that that they were behind the scenes. And we've also seen information coming out of Axios that has reaffirmed that essentially the entire construct of the negotiations between the United States and Iran was fundamentally to distort Iran's sort of focus point by alluding them to believe that yes, there's going to be some sort of peaceful negotiation, whilst behind the scenes the United States and Israel were orchestrating an attack on Iran. So if anything, it was just meant to trick Iran. And this is basically a modus operandi of the West. We've seen it happen repeatedly. We've seen it happen with the ceasefire in Syria back in 2019. We saw it happen with the Minsk agreements between Russia and Ukraine. I can see, Greg, you want to say something. So
yeah, I just wanted to add like Soleimani in Iraq, the assassination there,
Mm-hmm.
the negotiations with Nasrallah, with Hezbollah during this last iteration of the war in Lebanon, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is the basic modus operandi of the United States. They'll allude to they'll act as though that they're trying to negotiate with the parties in question, and behind the scenes, they are basically creating the necessary conditions by which to orchestrate an attack. And I mean, again, like with regards to Russia and Ukraine, we saw the former Chancellor Angela Merkel, who had essentially disclosed back in 2023 that the whole purpose of the Minsk agreements was to allow Ukraine to buy time and militarize in order to orchestrate an attack or be ready for war, essentially, with Russia, as opposed to actually implementation, which would actually have avoided a war in that instance. So we're seeing the same thing actually happen right now in Iran. And one of the reasons I argued that this was going to happen, my perspective on this was, they need to weaken Iran. Now, they can't do it through conventional means because Iran has proven, especially over the course of the last 3 days, that they do have the military power in order to counter Israel. However, even as I think Batool also stated, even if the United States was to actively get involved in Iran, the reality of the situation is it would be a very difficult thing to accomplish. And again, going back to the same sort of policy paper that I've referenced on copious occasions now, we would go back to the path of Persia. They even have reiterated in that point that any sort of military intervention or sort of direct military action against Iran would automatically fail, because Iran is a massive country. It's got a very sophisticated air defense systems. It has a sophisticated sort of missile and ballistic missile capability. You will not be able to infiltrate the Iranian airspace easily in order to be able to conduct the sort of sophisticated blows that they would have normally been able to do to a country, for example, that doesn't have that kind of sophistication that Iran has been able to execute. So therefore, even with the assistance of the United States military, which, by the way, and this is an important one, has proven itself to be incapable, not in terms of the United States military itself, but the Western military infrastructure as a whole has proven itself to be inadequate. They would not be able to counter Iran directly. And I just want to reference here very, very quickly the situation in Ukraine, fundamentally, because it's going to connect to what's happening in Iran at the moment. We know that over the last 2 or 3 years, NATO has essentially, most of the countries in NATO have been demilitarized. They're also struggling essentially with ammunition stockpiles. We have the United States is also now trying to mass produce javelins. Their Patriot systems are severely have been reduced in numbers because of sending it over to to Ukraine. So as it currently stands, the West lacks the sort of military kind of infrastructure and stockpile and reserves to be able to essentially stretch its ability over into combating Iran in the same way that he tried to combat in Ukraine. I don't see the United States actively actually engaging with Iran. And so what's going to happen in Iran, and this is what I just want to finish off quickly, we're going to see them try to demoralize Iran, the state of Iran, its military and political apparatus, its defense apparatus internally. And they're going to do so by establishing what I call these sort of asymmetrical intelligence operations within Iran. And that is why 90% of the attacks have been happening with car bombs, sabotage, and all these other mechanisms, because they want to demoralize Iran internally.
Right. Oh, and this is something that they've been trying to do for a while. And I'm just going to get to you in a second. I kind of wrote out this kind of just based off my experience from like the whole military intelligence aspect, like what we wanted to do, even back when I was in special operations at Afghanistan. It's like the playbook really doesn't change. And so I just bear with me for like a 2-minute monologue while I kind of like paint out like how this stuff generally works. And then I'd like your response to it, whether or not you think this is viable, Batool or not, or what, because Iran's always been painted as this like post-revolutionary weak state, while at the same time, being the biggest threat to the United States. And I just wrote that after watching the distance conflict erupt across West Asia over the past few days, it's clear that the U.S. and Israel did not launch this war against Iran to try to eliminate the nuclear sites. They know they can't. They're too hardened and dispersed. Any damage can be rebuilt over time because they can't destroy the knowledge, despite how many scientists and professors they killed over the weekend, including their families. They launched it to cause a phased, complete collapse in Iran. Phase 1, eliminate the top military IRGC leaders and scientists associated with the with the nuclear program, despite massacring civilians and in building collapses. They want to be able to propagate the narrative that they are being restrained and only targeting dangerous, high-value targets. They experienced a restrained strategic patience response from Iran in the vein of the two previous Operation True Promises. And regardless of how effective the strikes were, we saw massive Iron Dome failures in Tel Aviv and Haifa. They saw that Iran wasn't willing to meet them at the same level of escalation, though this will perhaps change in the coming week. Now, we can argue whether or not that's true or not, but phase two, they will begin to target political leaders, starting with Ayatollah Khamenei. Their hope is not regime change, in my estimation, to reinstate a fascist Zionist monarchy of the glitterati that harkens back to the 1970s. We know that the Iranian people, as diverse and varied in political opinion as they are, wouldn't accept that. The U.S. foreign policy playbook demands another Libya, another Syria, a massive consent manufacturing media and propaganda campaign in conjunction with the arming, funding, and deployment of proxy militias and terrorist networks in tandem with the Gulf Arab shield puppet regimes and NATO. So the third phase is a multilateral civil war that will end with the balkanization of the country. The MEK, the Mujahideen al-Khalq, which has a long history of U.S. intelligence cooperation and other similar proxy forces, having been trained in Turkey, Azerbaijan, and certain parts of Europe, will be mobilized. And we can reasonably expect and this is what you were referring to, Elina, we can reasonably expect a rash of car bombings and bazaars and sporting events to shake people's confidence in the enforcement capabilities of the government. I would be 0% surprised if ISIS-K, Islamic State in the Khorasan, reappeared right on schedule. And while Trump clearly ran political cover during the nuclear deal negotiations for Israel, indeed, the whole falling out drama between himself and Netanyahu was entirely ginned up, just like under Biden. It's important to apprehend this is not a Trump decision. It would have happened under Harris. This is the unrelenting and unchanging violent logic of U.S. empire, which now knows only force. Like, no matter the president, the military, industrial, media, political, intelligence, and academic complex is absolutely on board. And Iran and its axis of resistance, resistance to monolithic U.S., Israeli, NATO hegemony in West Asia is the first piece on the board that needs to fall, never to rise again, because Iran's increasing security and civic alliance with Russia and China must be smashed, because Russia and China must too also be isolated and choked in order for the U.S. to maintain its imperium. So, already the hawkish Atlantic Council think tank is writing position papers on how this might happen. From yesterday, quote, Friday's Israeli strike on Iran occurred under relatively favorable conditions. Already degraded air defenses, neutralized proxies, and no existing nuclear deterrent, complicating direct comparisons to potential preemptive strikes on true U.S. peers such as Russia or China. Still, the concepts retain value worth exploring as Western militaries seek unconventional options to address emerging threats. And so I basically see this as not necessarily a regime change operation, but an existential threat to not necessarily, not only the state of Iran as, a political entity, but also it as a nation, as a people. I think they would like to get rid of that as well. What do you agree, disagree?
Yes, absolutely. I do agree. Until Iran is regionally uprooted, Israel cannot feel secure. That's the crux of it. Since October the 7th, Israel has been waging an existential war. Israel wants to change almost its functional role regionally through its size. We had Netanyahu coming out to the UN and talking about, quote unquote, this new Middle East project in which Israel will be at its helm. Ultimately, the changing of the maps of the region. We saw that in Syria, of course, with Israeli expansionism into there through the relaunching of the HTS and the Al-Qaeda rats that were taken out of the prisons. And also in Lebanon, that heightened aggression in Lebanon, in which, of course, America greenlit it because, again, it wanted to see the extent of Israel's capabilities on the ground. And if it managed to succeed, then, of course, they would put them at the helm of the region. But the problem with Israel, of course, becomes when it fails in its functional role. So with the resistance beating hot in Iran, that is still so strong, that does not compromise when it comes to Israel. If we remember when Netanyahu was asked what's the biggest threat to Israel, he said number 1, Iran, number 2, Iran, and number 3, Iran, because Iran ultimately considers Israel to be its red line, and Iran is the beating heart for the whole resistance axis in the region. So as you've mentioned, absolutely correct. Iran is considered an existential threat. So its capabilities are also, by extension, an existential threat, whether it's ballistic or whether it's nuclear. So Israel's been lobbying America for this war for decades, and we know this. But when it has failed to get America to fight on its behalf, it requested to begin the war itself in hopes that then America can finish it off for it and to drag it in. But it's important that I stress this. Israel is the tool in America's hand, not America in Israel's hand. This is very important to understand, that America won't be dragged to Israel's square unless it deems that dragging within its own interests. So the main goal for Israel is expanding its size so that it becomes the main regional player within Trump's new regional vision as a stable region, because Trump ultimately wants a stable region in which he can pass his economic vision and plans with a main power that America deals with to push through those kinds of economic plans. That was why Trump was a big proponent of the Abraham Accords, you know, creating that synergy between Israel, this technological hub, and all of these Arab states to sideline the resistance. But obviously that is hinged on Israel itself being a secure and viable entity. And with Israel's size, of course, we know it occupies 80% of historic Palestine, 1948 historic Palestine, obviously parts of Syria as well. But that is not deemed enough for Israel to play this functional role. So now we're seeing Israel having reached its absolute maximum, and America as well. Like they tried and tested, of course, Gaza, Yemen, Lebanon, and now they're going to the heart, which is Iran. When they see that this campaign leads to no victory, and it will lead to the opposite results than what is intended, then what we're going to see is the regional power that prevails against all of the threats right now, because we're at such a crossroads and at such an important point. That regional power that prevails, whether it's Iran or whether it's Israel, will have proved itself. And America in this situation is just watching. It's almost like watching to see what that outcome is, of course, whilst unconditionally supporting the Israeli occupation entity in terms of what it needs to be the victor in that situation. But when Israel proves to be a failure, all the substitutions that America has for Israel, and even that Israel has for itself and its projected role, all of those will fall. Either Israel paralyzes Iran and it emerges victorious and it consolidates its terror and its reign of hegemony as the modus operandi in the region, or they fail in paralyzing Iran. And that will shake Israel's very foundations. And so when not only the political legitimacy for Israel's actions are stripped of it, but its military legitimacy as well, we're talking about the end of the Israeli occupation entity, because it means that the resistance axis will have further consolidated itself. Its influence will expand, and we can even expect other places and nations who have not considered to join this confrontation. And so with this kind of escalation against Iran, I think we're at the level of breaking bones, and the failure in paralyzing Iran, the beating heart of the resistance, will lead to increasing power and influence of the resistance. And this will consolidate. Israel's main feature will become that it is a failure. That would ultimately become its core attribute. But I do believe that in all of this, Israel is really committing suicide. It's really shooting itself in the foot. Either Israel's stupid or it's committing suicide. Because I think if they anticipated such a response as we've seen, and Iran's ability to be this precise, to cause this level of destruction, Iran has shown that it's able to overcome layers of air defenses, from the Iron Dome to the David Sling to the THAAD system. And it's also willing to go right to the end. I think if Israel anticipated this kind of response from Iran, I don't think they would have agreed to enter, of course, barring Netanyahu on the side. But their comprehension of the strategic patience, which is what you mentioned, Greg, and Iran's limited strikes in Operation True Promise 1-2 might have given them the impression that Iran would restrain.
I mean, well, okay. And before I get Elina's response, I mean, we generally take a more pessimistic view, I kind of believe. But like when we talk about the actual character of the strikes, right? One final note I had was like, based on the pace and the target profiles of Iran's retaliatory strikes, given that they can spoof the Iron Dome, flood the airspace with enough munitions to actually put rounds on target, it doesn't seem like they're committed to a war of victory, at least from like a superficial sense, because Israel has no strategic depth. If Iran wanted to reestablish deterrence, they would target critical infrastructure, such as like desalination plants, electricity, communication hubs, critical agricultural supply, ports, and airports. Why? Either if you guys want to have a discussion, like why wouldn't they pick those target profiles if they really wanted to? Like,
did they not target Haifa
drive it in?
yesterday? Did they not
What?
target the Haifa port yesterday?
They targeted the power plant in Haifa yesterday. That
Okay.
was the first time we've seen that. Yes, they have targeted it. Now, okay, so I just want to say a couple of things that I'm going to answer as well, what Greg just kind of asked. I do think it's important to kind of make certain that we understand that, you know, the way I see it anyway, the United States isn't just a passive observer. It is actively involved in what is happening. I mean, they're actively involved from the intelligence that has been gathering. I mean, the CNN wrote an article just about a month ago saying that effectively they had insider information. We know this to be a fact anyway, that the United States has been actively accumulating the necessary intelligence in order to orchestrate this attack. And whether it be through satellites, surveillance, etc., the United States is part and parcel of this attack, including obviously monitoring the other remaining factions within Iraq, etc., of the acts of resistance as well. And by monitoring them, you're obviously it does obviously come into play, and it does help Israel by giving it a certain degree of protection, so to speak. Now, with regards to what Greg has said, I would agree. This is the thing. The way I see it is that Israel does not have the capacity to destroy Iran militarily or its nuclear facilities. This is why an article that was published on Ynet or Enet, I'm not sure how they pronounce it, but the Hebrew media outlet, is it Ynet? Yeah, they were publishing a piece as well, and I think it was like about other sort of Hebrew media outlets that essentially were saying that the reason that they need the United States to intervene is fundamentally because at the end of the day, the vast majority of nuclear sites and even key military sites are deep within, deep underground. They cannot be penetrated easily. The vast majority of Iran is a mountainous terrain for the most part. And like I said, they have such sophisticated air defense systems that it's not easy to be able to get into Iran and to target them. And to do so, you need to target them with, bunker buster bombs, and that to actually be able to do that, you would actually need more assistance from the United States to be able to do so. And so it's pretty much impossible to be able to enter Iran in that magnitude. And that's why I want to go back to what I was saying earlier with regards to the sort of asymmetrical intelligence operations that are happening in Iran. And I think this is where the crux of what's happening, what will happen in Iran is going to be played out. Because in an article that was published by the Wall Street Journal, and when you start seeing the liberal media and they're publishing particular articles and they're echoing certain sentiments and objectives, you need to start decoding them and understanding what message it is that they're trying to send. And the article was actually labeled, it was titled rather, the supreme leader is essentially being cornered, or it's been exposed. And the general sort of thesis of that article articulates that effectively, the fact that Iran, first of all, was caught unaware, the way that they were caught unaware, the fact that you had so many Mossad operatives that had essentially taken in drones and missiles, and they have secret bases in Iran that were able to target their air defense systems. Not all of them, just a small number of them, but in the key particular areas that they were about to strike. The fact that they were able to target, launch pad areas that were ready to retaliate instantly in order to give Israel a leading sort of start. And the fact that, like I said, according to the media that I'm seeing and the sort of reports that I'm seeing coming out of Iran, 90% of the casualties, 90% of the harm that is happening within Iran at the moment is coming from internal sabotage operations by Mossad operatives. So what does this tell us? It means that Iran, the intelligence in Iran has dropped the ball. And I find this to be rather problematic. Why? Because we have been, the genocide in Gaza has been taking place for almost 2 years. And we've obviously seen, Israel target, the Axis factions. We saw what they did to the south of Lebanon. We saw what happened to Hezbollah. And we also saw them target Iran twice, 3 times over the course of the last 2 years. And given the fact that prior to these attacks, throughout the entire process of the negotiations, you saw the U.S. administration in the forms of Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth consistently threaten Iran with military action, Iran should have been well prepared. And even Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Iran, again, in what was supposed to be, I think, in a military complex, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm not remembering that correctly. So if there's something that Iran, I would say, is it's probably like a liability for Iran, it's not its military capacity. Its military capacity is proven to be incredibly apt, but it has to do with its
counterintelligence.
Intelligence. Yeah, its intelligence is it's proven to be incredibly problematic. And what's worse about all this is that we're seeing that, senior IRGC, commanders have been killed in the first day. Okay, they were caught unaware. But we were on day 3, and yesterday, the intelligence chief of the IRGC was killed alongside his deputy and alongside one other person. These are supposed to be the chief of intelligence. The individuals are supposed to be making sure that these sort of assassinations are not taking place, and yet we saw that take place again yesterday. And why I feel like this is important, and this is sort of going back to the sort of the article published by the Wall Street Journal, is because the whole agenda here is that they're going to try to create a degree of loss of confidence in the Iranian people with regards to their intelligence apparatus, their political establishment, and their leadership. And when that happens, this is where it becomes very dangerous, because if that happens, not when that happens, if that happens, because, like Batool said, the Iranian spirit, and if there's one thing that Iranians will always, come behind, it's their anti-imperialist sort of spirit in trying to counter the West, and particularly Israel. But even by demoralizing their leadership, this could put a lot of political pressure on Khamenei. But what's most important, and what's been articulated quite a lot, is probably even killing Khamenei himself. And if that was to happen,
that's absolutely legal.
That's I mean, and the fact that Trump had to veto this apparently, and when they say Trump vetoed this does 2 purposes. First of all, it's a psychological warfare against the supreme leader himself and against the Iranian establishment itself, in order to obviously be concerned that there's direct attacks onto his life. But secondly, it is meant to sort of detach the United States away from any sort of action that may be taken against Khamenei. And that's the thing. If they do actually take on Khamenei, we have a major problem, because
Well, I know what the problem is. Their entire thing that they've been trying to do is degrade international law to where it no longer matters. So the assassination of such like the supreme leader itself would be hugely destabilizing. Not even regionally, but to the post World War II order of what that would even look like. Because right now, basically, the whole justification of assassinating Nasrallah, even though he was an elected official, was he was a terrorist. This would be doing a politically assassinating the head of state would be an insane precedent to set, by the way. And I don't know if you want to finish your point quickly. I just want to point that out.
Yeah, just what I want to say is that that's what they want for the West anyway, and for the United States. An ultimate a win in Iran is simply to destabilize Iran internally. That would be the ultimate win. It's not, you cannot conquer it; you can just destabilize it. And again, that would be the ultimate win.
That's why it's kind of like an existential war of survival, not just for the political entity, but the nation, because of course there's already plans in place. They've had them for years. The CIA, Mossad, and Gulf intelligence services will stoke ethnic and religious tensions, arm sectarian militias as they devolve into what they would want, like overt death squads in service of territorial warlords. This is what we've always wanted. So it's like the kind of neocon Zionist fever dream to manifest this apocalyptic vision on millions of Iranians, and when the people of the Sahel, and then the people of the Sahel countries in Africa, whose governments are expelling U.S. and French troops, and then despite nuclear deterrence, Russia and China, and anyone who resists. And they did the same thing, kind of the diplomatic ploys with Nasrallah. Israel got the U.S. to relay to him and Hezbollah that they were going to sign a ceasefire to lull them into a false sense of security. Then they assassinated him, and this is standard operating procedure for the empire: diplomacy as deception. So Batool, I guess, it's kind of despairing for some people, hearing what's going on, what the plans are. I mean, how viable do you think this is, as a strategy, as something to basically just wager on from a foreign policy perspective? will this kind of like uprising that they hope to, inculcate through massive economic sanctions, destroying the working class, laying the grounds for like an austerity government where people will have like a popular revolution against it. If the security conditions degrade in the event of like more senior level assassinations in conjunction with a terror campaign, like, do you think this is even a workable strategy based off of like the conditions? And of course, Iranians are very like pluralistic people. There's not just like one subset or group. I don't know. What are your general thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think every Israeli strategy is really bringing the opposite of the results intended. This kind of brazen and screaming aggression on Iran right now is really strengthening the national strength. Even those against the government will support it in such a time. I mean, it's mad that someone like Naftali Bennett thinks that he can come out and directly appeal to the Iranians in Iran, the ones who actually count, right, as far as the system of the Islamic Republic is concerned, and not those Shahis who you find in counter protests with Israeli flags. I mean, if Iranians thought about turning against their government, they might just change their mind the moment someone like Netanyahu or Naftali Bennett opens its mouth. The majority of the nation is obviously against the Israeli aggression. And it's mad how Israel has turned Iran into an object of adoration and admiration globally, and especially within the Muslim Ummah, that it has spent absolute decades trying to vilify and trying to basically stoke sectarianism and paint it as, this Shiite crescent that's coming to take over. So Israel's intention in turning people against the government through creating the most unbearable conditions in terms of striking hospitals, as we've been seeing, and striking civilian areas, is having the opposite effect. People support even the capital punishments against the collaborators. I think it was today, one of the collaborators was hung, he was executed. So yes, just in terms of the point that Elina was making, Israel has accumulated its penetrations within Iran. Obviously, that's because it sees Iran as the foremost enemy and the largest in its size. And there are opposition groups, like you've mentioned, like the MEK within Iran. And that penetration does exist on all intelligence levels. And it's wide and it's organized. Like, it's not an individualized effort. Like, there's a web of networks. And we've seen that in terms of the extent to which Iran, the security apparatus, has managed to find trucks packed with suicide drones. They've intercepted some of them in tunnels, around 200 kilograms of explosives, like 24 drones. Launch platforms were even detected. So that penetration has ultimately turned, like, Israel has been working on this for years and years now, turning it from an individual effort to like this web of like network. And with such an expansive country, though, and I think that's important to mention, I think this is, in the grand scheme of things, limited in terms of jeopardizing the outcomes specifically of this war. Because if we look at Iran, Iran is too big to paralyze. Yes, Israel has superiority in its air capabilities and its intelligence. That's where it reigns supreme. But if you consider the overall capabilities of the Islamic Republic, if we're looking at it geographically, you're talking about 13 states, 1.5 million square kilometers. You can fit 60 Israels into Iran. It's crazy, the stupidity of Netanyahu. Demographically speaking, a 90 million population strong. The general influence that Iran has over the region. The high tolerance and experience in difficulties. This is very important. It all goes down to the morale of the people.
Yeah, I mean, how many people died in the war with Saddam? And how many casualties were they able to absorb? I mean,
500,000.
The tolerance level between Iran and Israel is completely different.
8 years, by the way, 8 years of war. And it wasn't like the people were complaining to the leadership of Imam Khomeini, like, this is stringing out for way, way too long. Like, they managed in the most difficult circumstances because they were besieged by the whole world. The revolution had just taken place and it was designed to cripple and not allow Iran to establish itself, essentially. But they fought under the most extreme conditions. And then you've had 4 decades of sanctions and war. But we've seen that Iran, in its ability to manufacture, has reigned supreme. And they may be able to, I think, halt aspects of Iran's nuclear program, even big and important chunks, through some of these strikes. But the capabilities and the human resources for these very nuclear programs are there. In the same way that Iran has developed all of its defenses, it is unable to finish these capabilities and deal a blow to them because the capabilities of Iran are not exported It's from within. Iran is self-sufficient. Iran has adapted to besiegement and the worst conditions it has developed. So it will continue to develop. And even during the course of this war, I feel like this war and introducing this new and effective and active element of the Islamic Republic is really can have such an effect as turning the tables in this respect and really affecting the outcomes of the whole region, especially in what we've seen with these strong hits. And Iran is really developing a kind of strong prestige, and even America seeing the extent of the precision of Iran's hits, they will fear what will happen to their own bases if they directly get involved to save Israel if the situation becomes too bad for it.
Yeah, I think one of the major defense questions right now with in U.S. circles is like, how many rockets do they actually have that they, I mean, that's the real question, and that's what they're going to watch going forward.
I also want to add something here. I do think it's important to also know, I agree with everything Batool said, because I've also said the same thing. When Netanyahu had actually come out and effectively started calling on the Iranian people to start a revolution, I said it's quite ironic because the reality of the situation is the Iranian people will galvanize more so now behind probably their leadership than they have in even probably a very long time. Whereas, because, at the end of the day, I've said this over and over.
Especially when you hit civilian targets.
Yeah, but for the court, like Batool said, I mean, the Iranian people have suffered the wrath of imperialism for the last 40 years. Sanctions are an illegal form of, an illegal form of warfare that, ultimately are a form of collective punishment on a civilian population. This is what the Iranian people have had to endure for the last 40 years, and they have been able to come out of that on top. And even that didn't manage to break the spirit of the Iranian people. And so the reality of the situation is the Iranian people simultaneously also understand what it is to live in hardship, whereas the Israelis absolutely do not. And they're going to be the ones that are going to relapse rather quickly. However, there's one thing that I feel like doesn't get spoken about enough. And what it is that the type of damage, not to nuclear facilities. I was actually as well on another program recently, and I was saying that the potential harm that could be inflicted on Iran is damage to oil infrastructure. This could be very harmful for Iran, and this would also serve Western interest in multiple ways. So what do I mean? First of all, this is the first time in the last several years, the first time that we're now seeing Iran sort of come out of that sort of economic asphyxiation and warfare that has essentially attempted to cripple them and isolate them as a pariah state over the years. Why? Because of the fact, we have now the inauguration of BRICS, and the fact that now they're a part of BRICS, but also simultaneously, the fact that 25% of the world has effectively been sanctioned. So no major states like Russia anymore have nothing to lose by collaborating with Iran, working with Iran, engaging in trade agreements with Iran, because they already sanctioned themselves. The same thing applies to a certain extent with China, and China has some other advantages over this, but that's a conversation for another time. But, Iran is now at its most prosperous time. And so and furthermore, Iran is, and I've said this before, Iran is the epicenter and the hub of the BRI, with China and Iran coming together and working together on the, these corridors that they're establishing. And bear in mind, for China, the vast majority of its oil comes from Iran. So if you want to inflict damage on BRICS, damage on the BRI, damage to Iran, and then by extension China, which is the ultimate objective here at the end of the day, you can definitely inflict harm on Iran with regards to damaging their oil infrastructure or just generally their resource infrastructure, therefore crippling or attempting to sort of damage the economy of a country that is only now sort of coming into its own, the way, because of its new allegiances and because of the material conditions that have changed around the world over the course of the last decade. And I do think that is very important going forward.
Yeah, and absolutely, this is basically all. This all goes back to China. There was supposed to be a geostrategic shift to China, which is one of the main reasons that Biden actually wrapped up the war in Afghanistan, and we had that disastrous withdrawal. Because it was like, all right, we're getting bogged down here, time to move on to China. But of course, and that's the U.S. playbook. But I guess, yeah, I was just kind of like skimming through a couple of like these hawkish think tank articles, and all of them you can read between the lines, and that's what it's really about. And I did want to talk about propaganda here for the last little bit because Batool mentioned Naftali Bennett and Benjamin Netanyahu directly appealing to the people of Iran, to do this. But it's not really for the people of Iran. It's for people of the West, right?
But, I just want to say, before we get into the propaganda, I just want to say one last small thing. Because before Batool mentioned that, this is sort of a strategic approach that Iran is taking, strategic patience that it has shown over the course of time. I do believe that they need to be more assertive, as you said, on their targets. The targets that they're basically targeting in Israel. Like you said, more power plants, more ports. We need complete and effective destruction on Israel, and we need it effectively now. Because if Iran continues the sort of slow approach, going back to the point that I made with regards to the oil infrastructure, they will continue to hit Iran, knowing that Iran isn't going to go full force. They need to take the reins. I think they need to be more assertive in their approach, and they need to do that now, because I think it would be very. I personally believe that the United States will try to involve itself, maybe not completely directly, but the objective is behind the scenes to try and inflict as much harm as possible. The only way to stop that is by inflicting as much harm as possible on Israel, and to do so now. There's no reason to prolong. I just wanted to say that quickly.
And I would just want to say that I think they're trying to calibrate it. So, because maybe you can give your thoughts here, Batool. Like, they're trying to make sure that they don't spur the U.S. by causing too much damage to get directly involved. I don't know, something like that.
I don't think Iran is demonstrating. I think Iran is at a pace right now where it's proved that it's not practicing restraint. I mean, the extent to which it has struck, I was quite surprised. I expected Iran to show more restraint. So if I give you some examples of the areas that they struck yesterday, bearing in mind the absolute military censorship that also exists within the Israeli occupation entity right now, and banning kind of taking any photos or making it clear where they've struck. So yesterday
that was pretty hilarious.
Yeah, so yesterday they struck power grids that led to widespread blackouts. They struck an Israeli army camp in the Galilee, in the Naqab area, so Negev, and Everton Air Base. That's where the Dimona facility is as well. There was extreme censorship regarding anything that happened there. The Ramat Gan, a 22-story building, reportedly destroyed. Haifa power station struck by hypersonic missiles, struck on Bill Habel building, major electricity and oil infrastructure. So what Elina was mentioning, the Bazan chemicals complex, the Haifa refinery was struck, multiple sites hit within Tel Aviv. This was all within one round of barrage that happened in the evening yesterday. Early morning today. Those were the 100 Iranian ballistic missiles that came through. So it was evening for us, but it was slightly morning for them. So I think in terms of the rate that Iran is going in, and it's showing that it's willing to go all the way to the end. And this is a war that, as far as they're concerned, can last for years. And they have the stockpiles for it to last for years. And for every, let's say, 20 of their old stockpiles, they're using one new missile that can sharply hit and strike the targets that it wants, thereby confusing the whole air defense systems and the various layers that exist. So I think in terms of the pace that Iran is going in, it's very devastating for the Israeli occupation entity. It's hard to see, and you're also seeing some of the reaction that's coming out of Israel. So you had, I think it was one of the Israeli journalists that was telling to just shut the hell up, basically. He's saying, whilst you're talking about exacting a maximum price on Iran, look at our people. Like, our people don't have homes to sleep in. Bomb shelters are being struck right now. I mean, if you strike a bomb shelter or that becomes a part of the collateral damage, I mean, really, you're striking the essence of what Israel stands for. There's absolutely zero safety right now for the settlers. They do not feel safe within. Like, that in and of itself is suicide for Israel.
Yeah, I mean, because if we know one thing from colonial history, once the settlers start picking up and leaving, the project goes into cascade failure. So... But I mean, we're seeing a lot of propaganda, though, ginned up, basically to keep the options open and to mislead the American people by what's going on. I think Counterpoint Front made a pretty good video on just basically the reporting headlines that I would like to just draw people's attention to, because it's kind of indicative for me of dying empire things, because they're trying to gin up this kind of Iraq era WMD scare. And they've been trying to do it since like 2001. Like on 9/11, Benjamin Netanyahu came out with a statement saying, this Iran, we can't let Iran have nukes. Every year it's been a thing. But let's just examine some of the headlines and how the media frenzies kind of handled this.
Western media is covering the current Iran-Israel conflict. When Israel struck Iran, headlines framed it as preemptive or self-defense, echoing Israel's narrative almost word for word, but they rarely acknowledged the attack as unprovoked. Instead, they simply called it a strike or unprecedented, avoiding any suggestion of aggression. Coverage focused on supposed military or nuclear targets, with minimal mention of the dozens of civilians killed. And Israel's claim that Iran's nuclear program is an existential threat was repeated, with little to no challenge or nuance. On top of this, Iran's government is consistently referred to as a regime, a loaded term used to paint it as hostile or illegitimate. But when Iran retaliated, the tone was very much different. Reports highlighted Israeli civilian areas being hit, even though casualties were in single digits. Some outlets did use the word retaliatory when referring to Iran's strikes, an improvement from earlier coverage where that framing was missing entirely. Still, the broader trend is clear. Israel's narrative is amplified, whereas Iran's is minimized. And that matters, because media framing shapes how the world understands the conflict, whether it sees an unprovoked act of war by Israel or a necessary strike against a rogue state. And the danger? If Israel's narrative dominates, it could justify even more violence in the region.
We were hearing this week.
All right, I guess this is a short clip from Tucker Carlson interviewing Jeffrey Sachs.
That Iran is just weeks away from building a nuclear weapon, and so we need to take out the nuclear sites. We need to effect regime change in Iran. I feel like I've been hearing that Iran is weeks away from nuclear weapon for at least 25 years.
Yes, verbatim at least a decade, and for longer in substance, yes. Neighbors like the Saudis and others in the Gulf do not want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Iran's major ally, Russia, does not want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. But Iran does not want to be defeated militarily by Israel, does not want to be bombed to hell by Israel, and does not want to be sanctioned to death economically by the United States, which the U.S. has been doing now for endless years.
All right, and basically, they're pulling out all the tricks, and just to draw the audience's attention to what the tricks are, we've got even the big propagandist account doing this. Laura Loomer, every American woman should be rooting for the women of Iran to get their freedom by overthrowing the Iranian regime. And of course, we use this same femme-washing propaganda to justify our 2-decade violent occupation of Afghanistan. And of course, again, I assert that the goal isn't to implement regime change to save women. It is to turn Iran into a balkanized Libya or Syria. And, millions upon millions of lives would be destroyed. Decidedly not great for the women of Iran. I guess just I wanted each of your opinions on this, just basically by trying to analyze propaganda and the media space in terms of kind of broadcasting foreign policy. Do you see this as like a build up to armed intervention, or trying to gin up consent for this? Because I was just at the covering the Trump military parade, and I was with Max Blumenthal, and we were doing interviews of as many people we could find. Should the U.S. get involved with Iran? And there's just 0% enthusiasm, even amongst the hardened Trump crowd. So I don't know exactly what they think they're going to accomplish with this, based on what's going on the home front.
I don't know if Batool wants to answer first, and then I can answer afterwards.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I think the crux of what you're saying is absolutely true, Greg, in the essence that coups and color revolutions ultimately depend on propaganda being strong, because the alternative is to besiege and to sanction a people and to get them to the point where they will be so stripped of their hope, basically, that they will just topple the government. But we have examples of that. So, for example, in Ukraine, it wasn't very difficult to topple Yanukovych, who was seen as politically neutral as far as NATO was concerned, because there wasn't a strong attachment between the leadership, the system, and the people of Ukraine. But in the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran, I think the reality on the ground shows itself, and that is they are a people who have endured 4 decades of the worst crippling sanctions. I see that as a miracle. I haven't seen this model anywhere else in the world, where you have a people that are ultimately besieged to the extent that Iran has been, fought from all corners and all directions. And what America is telling Iran in return for removing its sanctions is, like, if you topple this government, you'll get the removal of sanctions in return. So the fact that they haven't toppled the government, and not only have they not toppled the government, but it's the expertise and it's the manpower of the people of Iran that is required to actually build Iran to the level of technological prowess that it shows and it has today, whether that's in the medical field, whether that's in the defense and the military field, whether that's in the technological when it comes to cybersecurity. Iran ranks as one of the 10 strongest countries in the world. That all depends on the capabilities and the energies of the people, which is it's very alive, it's very energetic. And Iran has proven that its democratic propensity is strong, in the sense that in elections you have 5-6 candidates, you have really heated discussions and debates that take place, and whoever is elected into a position of power really affects the outcome. So right now you have someone like Pezeshkian before him, who's a reformist. Before him you had the conservative Raisi. Before him you had the reformist Rouhani, who went forward with the JCPOA because that matched the mood that was on the streets, despite the fact that someone like Sayyid Ali Khamenei, who you would expect to be the dictator according to Western headlines, was opposed to the JCPOA, and right from the start said it's a catastrophic mistake to even negotiate with America. But he closed his mouth on the issue, and instead he resorted to using his speeches to wake the Iranian nation up and to tell them that actually negotiations with America is futile because America cannot be trusted. So he waited for the results on the ground to show themselves, to prove themselves, for the Iranian people to wake up ultimately. So his strategy and approach of decoding that propaganda was to make the Iranians see that, look, okay, like if we get to this certain point, then it's as a result of you not realizing the full picture. So it's like, let the events speak for themselves. And in a way, the Iranians are paying the price of these years of negotiations. But yes, absolutely, propaganda has an effect. But what we see with the Islamic Republic of Iran is that it's an active and energetic nation. And the democratic nature of the society is, I would say, strong. I'd say it's much more democratic than the West.
Yeah. And also when it comes to, I mean, I just think about the ongoing genocide in Gaza and what that's done for U.S. propaganda and soft power globally. It's just, there's no coming back from it. So anyways, Elina.
Yeah, I was actually going to say exactly the same thing. So we saw even Ursula von der Leyen, and I had mentioned this to you guys before we actually started recording here today. She had also made, a grand speech, and she also had posted on her social media accounts, or members of her team had posted on her social media accounts, that effectively, much like the video that you have just posted, that Israel is acting in self-defense, and that, the world has to understand that in this case, Iran is the aggressor. What we're actively seeing here is the mass gaslighting of the international audience, particularly geared towards the Western audience, to the point that, it's almost as though individuals are going to start questioning their own sort of perception of the events. The events that transpired were rather clear. Israel attacked Iran, and the reason for that attack is under the conditions of they have nuclear, there's suspicions that they're creating or establishing nuclear weapons, which for the most part there's been no evidence for that. But then again, there is a history in the past with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, where we had very little evidence for that, and yet somehow, they were still trying to, flush this narrative down people's throats. I could finish my point, but if you want to say something, and then I'll finish my point.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to, just for context, to make how absurd all of this propaganda is, because it's accessible via open source. Tulsi Gabbard, the director of the Office of National Intelligence, during this year's global threat assessment in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee, said, we have no intelligence that Iran was trying to develop a nuclear weapon after 2003.
Yeah, I was about to even say that. And then I was also going to mention even J.D. Vance. He was even questioned recently. And he's like, I don't know. How can you not know? You're the vice president. If there's any sort of hardcore evidence, especially for a country like Iran, which is flooded with Mossad agents, as we've seen, and obviously it is surveillanced to a certain extent by the imperialist powers at play. If there was any such evidence, they would have actually provided that evidence. But obviously that evidence doesn't exist, which is why they constantly create this fear-mongering among the Western audiences. And this is what they're trying to do again. again. However, like you accurately stated, I mean, the genocide that has taken place in Gaza and the impacts that had on the sort of rules-based order, but also on the perception that people have now of the liberal sort of mainstream media machine and understanding it as being an extension of the, sort of imperialist powers has radically changed now. They're more on board and understand how the media works and operates. And so to galvanize the Western audience in the way that they think that they're going to galvanize the Western audience in order to support any sort of I guess, intervention per se on Iran would not be possible. And not just that, there's the other angle here as well. For the vast majority of the public in the West, whether it's in the European Union, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in the United States, I mean, like I said, the European Union is already struggling significantly as a result of the economic implications that the war in Ukraine has had on their own economies, not just necessarily because of the cutting off of the valuable resources and what that has done to their economies and the inflation that has caused, the deindustrialization that has caused, as well as the impact that it's had on their own currency, but also from the context of, migration and that's why they have like there's such a growing far right movement taking place in different sort of areas now throughout the European Union. So I mean, actively now calling upon the populations both in the EU as well as the United States, which I mean Trump had basically won on a voter base that was calling for anti-migration policies to now, and also the other sort of voter base that he won off of was sort of the non-interventionist approach to now go into a war with Iran. No matter how much the Western media try to phase this, I don't think he will be successful in actually galvanizing the public in this instance against Iran.
Yeah. But they're going to try anyways because they have no other choice. Okay, we got like 2 minutes left. Any closing remarks before we round this out, Batool?
I'll just say as a closing remark that this war is existential for Israel, and Iran has to treat it as such as well, because this is ultimately Israel's last hope of survival. So these are the hits when we see Israel hitting to this extent. It's the hits of a drowning entity that wants to save itself. It's not the hits within a strategy of building the existence of the Israeli occupation entity. So it is fighting right now Israel at a life and death pace, but only someone as crazy as Netanyahu would launch this war in Iran, because it is and will have the opposite consequences of what they intend to achieve. Because if Israel doesn't manage to paralyze Iran, and I believe Iran is much bigger than to be paralyzed by Israel, then Israel will be weakened detrimentally. And for the first time, Israel is under this kind of fire. And the reverberations of it is even worse than the military destruction caused, because the whole concept of Israel as a secure haven is completely shattered. And in this, the Islamic Republic will have more legitimacy and will consolidate itself as the powerful entity in the region, that I believe that America itself will have to acknowledge Iran's regional strength once this war is over and it's proved itself.
And one of the reasons that they are so concerned about the hypersonic missile caches that Iran has, it's just because Iran's built this entire defense strategy based off of the limitations that they had, massive sanctions, kind of outdated Air Force. And I just wanted to point out, I don't want to harp on this too much because I'm trying to get Sergeant Major Dennis Fritz. He used to be a Air Force. He was at the Pentagon under Rumsfeld. He wrote the book Deadly Betrayal about the Iraq War. But I just want to get on him and talk about how insanely inefficient Israel's strikes on Iran are, sending fighter bombers, incredibly expensive fighter bombers that need to be refueled over Syrian and Iraqi airspace just to deliver one payload. Whereas, Iran just has to bring a cheap ballistic missile to a launch site and send it. Like the price differentials and the logistical differentials are just insane. And, I think we saw that in Yemen too. And I don't know, we got to end, but if you want to do one final remark on that point, Elina, before we close out.
But that's what happens when you have isolated countries and therefore put the material conditions under that require them to become self-sufficient. This is what happened with Iran. This is what's even happened in recent years with Russia, for example. So they were coerced and they were economically coerced, and they were obviously threatened to the point where they had to become self-sufficient. And so, this is part of the contradictions essentially of, how how imperialism and how capital essentially operates. When you're, trying to consistently suffocate your adversaries, you eventually create a situation, the conditions by which they strengthen themselves to the point that they can actually threaten your power. And what I was going to say with regards to that, when we're discussing Netanyahu, I wouldn't even say that it's just Netanyahu who's acting like a dying beast in his, in desperation. I would say it's the entirety of the West that are accumulating together and galvanizing behind him, even the United States, because like I said, it is important to understand that the United States is behind this. They're also assisting in the refueling. They're insisting in the intelligence. They're going to provide all the military equipment that Israel needs in order to do what it has to do, as we saw in basically Ukraine with Russia. And the way I will probably finish this is, just like Ukraine doesn't really have much of a hope to defeat Russia, for example, but they continuously are arming this machine in order to demoralize and destabilize and try to deplete Russia. They're going to try to do the same thing with Israel, with Iran, because another aspect here, and I just want to finish off of this point, is that they also want to see to what extent, they can actually deplete Iran, economically by, a protracted war. This is why I said earlier that they have to be as decisive as possible in striking, because eventually they're going to also try to see if they can do what their initial plan was in Russia, which is to strike oil refineries, etc., weaken its economy. But also having a war economy is, they believe they're going to try to weaken Iran in that way. I'm not saying it's going to work. I'm just trying to explain what their objectives are. We've seen that before.
It's not just,
and they will fight to the last Israeli, because they don't care about the Israelis in the same way they do not care about the Ukrainians. It's just a proxy, and it will be used to solidify the interests of the imperialist class. That's
I think that logic also applies to Netanyahu. I just want to say quickly, I think that logic also applies to Netanyahu. I think all of Israel is now hostage to Netanyahu. I think if other than Netanyahu was in power, we would not have seen a war continue for 20 months. That no one had that in their minds, that this war could continue for 20 months, because Israel's killing itself. Israel's shooting itself in the foot. No one except someone like Netanyahu, who doesn't care about the fate of Israel, who doesn't care about the interests of the Israeli occupation entity, but himself, would continue such a war that is ultimately weakening Israel literally by the day. It's suicidal.
I mean,
and
I don't know if I agree with that, though, because from what I've seen with the political establishment inside inside Israel, they haven't really necessarily opposed Netanyahu. I mean, they may on certain occasions make certain speeches, etc. But when it comes to the decision-making process, yes, there was the dissolution of the Knesset, which obviously didn't pass through because he decided to go after Iran.
Like Gallant didn't even support the war in Lebanon. Benny Gantz, the opposition, Lapid,
because they're in the opposition. That's what they say this because they're in opposition, and they try to tackle Netanyahu from the perspective.
But even Gallant, who was his he was the Secretary of Defense, he was against going into Lebanon because it was like the cost would be too much. But someone like Netanyahu kept pushing that because of the extreme right as well, Smotrich and the Ben-Gvirs. But if you take out Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and someone like Netanyahu, if other than him was in power, if you had Benny Gantz in power, this war would not have continued for 20 months.
But I think where I'll finish off is saying this: whoever, it's because they're in opposition. The reason I say that is because when you come into a position of power, eventually you become compromised by the interests of the class that essentially is funding your entire state. And that's why I always say it's the United States that is funding and pushing for this war. And they have entire policy papers that are geared towards using BB, using sort of the more radical aspect of Israel in order to kind of galvanize, Israel's operations in Iran. And then the United States will hide behind it. But if there was somebody else in power, they would probably try to compromise it. We've even seen it in the European Union. The European Union has destroyed itself economically. Everybody's asking, why the hell is Germany doing what it's doing? But that's because the political establishment or the ruling class is here. And if you look at sort of their investment and their sort of investment in capital assets in the US, it's so incredibly high that they become compromised from that angle. So eventually, someone like Gallant, he's a military person. And from a military perspective, he's thinking rationally, but eventually it's certain other powers that will galvanize that kind of operation is what I'm.
I think we need a part 2 for this.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, sorry,
okay.
yeah.
Well, you know what? We could maybe we can see how this plays out over the next week and come back next Monday. We'll see. I think Elina might be in Cyprus on missile lockdown, surrounded by a bunch of Israeli refugees trying to have raids on the
100,000. There's 100,000 of them in Cyprus.
Yeah.
100,000 of them. We're only a million people.
Insane.
Yeah, so I'm glad. I'm sure everybody is appreciating their presence there in Cyprus, having a great time. So I just wanted to end by saying, we've talked about a lot of things. And to Elina's last point, I kind of started off the episode, talking about how whether or not Trump was president, this has always been the U.S. position. Why play opened up with a clip of Hillary Clinton. This is not. I'm not entirely. It's more of the whole system, and of course, I'm exhausted. I just flew back from DC, so I'm not basically as eloquent. But yes, trying to balkanize, destroy Iran, do the same thing for governments in the Sahel region, Russia, and then eventually China. This is how we do things. We sanction, we sow dissent, propaganda, and hope for an outcome that basically ruins any sort of the potential for a regional challenge or a global challenge. So, all right, y'all, I think we are done. Also, Elina's camera is out, so thank you so much for listening.
Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Yeah, there's
all right,
something wrong with my camera.
Well, this has been State of Play on Mint Press News with Batool Subeiti and Elina Xenophontos. You can follow their work on social media, which we will link in the description. All right, thanks so much, and we will continue to report on this developing and unprecedented situation here at Mint Press News. Thank you so much for watching. Have an excellent Monday night.